the 14th of November, 1940. Somewhere above central England, 700 metres of cloud separates a Heinkel 111 bomber from the ground below. The pilot can see nothing. No city lights, no river bends, no factory chimneys. Britain is invisible tonight, swallowed whole by blackout and weather. But the navigator doesn't need to see. He's listening. Through his headphones comes a steady, continuous tone, a hum that tells him exactly where he is, threading an invisible line through the darkness like a wire stretched across the sky. As long as the tone stays even, the aircraft is on course. If it drifts left, he hears dots. If it drifts right, dashes. Simple, precise, devastating. Tonight's target is a city the navigator has never seen. He doesn't need to see it. He only needs to wait for a second tone to cross the first. When both signals merge in his headphones, the bombardier will release 1,200 kilograms of high explosive and incendiaries. The bombs will fall blind through cloud and darkness and land, according to the mathematics of radio physics, within 300 meters of the aiming point. This is not a guess. This is not dead reckoning. This is a technology that lets German bombers find a single factory in the middle of a blacked-out island from 400 kilometers away, in total darkness, through cloud, without ever seeing the ground. But tonight, something is wrong. The navigator doesn't know it yet. He can't know it. The tone in his headphones sounds exactly the same as it always does. Steady, confident, guiding. But the beam he's following is no longer pointing where the Germans aimed it. It has been bent. Not by physics, not by weather, but by a 28-year-old British physicist who is, at this precise moment, sitting in a basement office in London, waiting to see whether his theory will save a city or fail spectacularly. This is the story of the most extraordinary, invisible war of the Second World War. A battle fought not with bullets or bombs, but with radio waves and mathematics. A battle where the British turned Germany's most sophisticated weapon against itself, where bombers dropped their payloads on empty farmland believing they had hit factories, and where some Luftwaffe pilots became so lost they landed their aircraft at British airfields, thinking they were home. This is the story of the Battle of the Beams, and it began with a scrap of paper pulled from the pocket of a dead German pilot. By the spring of 1940, Britain faced an existential problem. German bombers were coming. Everyone knew this. The fall of France in June had given the Luftwaffe airfields within easy striking distance of every major British city. The question wasn't whether the bombing would come, but whether Britain could survive it. The mathematics of night bombing should have favoured the defenders. A bomber flying at 4,000 metres over a blacked-out country couldn't see its targets. Navigators relied on dead reckoning, calculating position from compass heading, airspeed and time. Over long distances, errors accumulated. Studies later showed that most RAF bombs landed miles from their intended targets. The same should have been true for the Luftwaffe, but British intelligence had noticed something troubling. German bombers were hitting their targets with accuracy that defied explanation. Bombs were falling not just on cities, but on specific factories, specific docks, specific railway junctions, in darkness, through cloud. Something was guiding them, but what? The clues arrived in fragments. In April 1940, a scrap of paper recovered from a downed German airman read, "Radio beacon Knickebein from 0600 hours on 315 degrees. 315 degrees was northwest. A plane flying from Germany to Britain would look south or east for a navigational beacon. Why northwest, and why did it specify a single fixed bearing? The paper landed on the desk of Dr. Reginald Victor Jones. Born in 1911 in Herne Hill, South London, the son of a postman and a grenadier guardsman, Jones had studied physics at Oxford under Frederick Lindemann, graduated with first-class honours, and completed his doctorate by age 23. By 1940, he was the Assistant Director of Scientific Intelligence at the Air Ministry, reporting directly to MI6. He was 28 years old, and the defence of Britain's cities was about to rest on whether he could solve a puzzle that senior military officials insisted didn't exist. Jones examined the scrap of paper and made a deduction. Knickebein, which translates as crooked leg, wasn't an ordinary navigational beacon. It was a directional radio beam. A plane could fly along this beam like a train on invisible rails, drop the bombs when a second beam crossed the first, and you had a precision bombing system that worked in total darkness. It was an elegant theory. The problem was, almost nobody believed him. Air Ministry officials dismissed the idea. Why would German pilots need such a system? British pilots managed without one. Frederick Lindemann, Churchill's own scientific advisor, argued that radio beams at the frequencies involved couldn't possibly follow the curvature of the Earth. They would simply shoot off into space. Jones was running out of allies. Then, in June 1940, an intercepted Enigma message changed everything. It read, "Cleves Knickebein is confirmed at position 53 degrees 24 minutes north and 1 degree west." Those were the coordinates of Retford, a town in central England. Cleves was one of the closest points in Germany to Britain. Jones realised a transmitter there must have been picked up by a German test flight over Retford. He took his evidence directly to Winston Churchill. On the 21st of June, Jones was summoned to a cabinet meeting at 10 Downing Street. He was the youngest and most junior person in the room. Churchill asked him to explain. Jones spoke for 20 minutes without interruption, laying out his deductions, his evidence, and his proposed countermeasures. Churchill later described this as one of his blackest moments of the war. The realization that the Germans could bomb any factory in Britain with precision, in darkness, through cloud, was terrifying. But he ordered immediate action. Find the beams and find a way to stop them. That very night, 3 Avro Anson aircraft, fitted with American Hallicrafters radio receivers, took off to search for the beams. The pilot of one aircraft flew into a signal on 31.5 MHz and tracked it across England. The navigator plotted its path. It intersected with a second beam directly over the Rolls-Royce engine factory at Derby, the only facility in Britain producing the Merlin engine, the heart of every Spitfire and Hurricane in the Royal Air Force. Had the Luftwaffe destroyed that factory, fighter command would have been crippled. The beams were real, and they were aimed at the most critical target in Britain. The Knickebein system was devastatingly simple. It was based on the Lorenz blind landing system already used at civilian airfields across Europe. 2 overlapping radio beams were transmitted from stations on the continent. One beam carried dots, the other dashes. Where the beams overlapped, the signals merged into a continuous tone. A pilot flying within this overlap zone, sometimes as narrow as 400 meters, would hear the steady tone and know he was precisely on course. A second beam from a different station crossed the first directly over the target. When the navigator heard both signals merge, the bombardier released the bombs. The entire system required no special equipment in the aircraft, beyond a slightly modified Lorenz receiver, equipment already installed in every German bomber. The countermeasure had to match the weapon's simplicity. Jones turned to physicist Robert Cockburn at the Telecommunications Research Establishment. Cockburn needed to build a system that could defeat the beams. He needed it immediately. There was no time for elegant engineering. Cockburn's first improvised jammers were modified medical diathermy machines, hospital equipment normally used for physiotherapy, repurposed to transmit interference on the Knickebein frequency. They were crude, barely adequate, and available immediately. That was what mattered. Within weeks, a more sophisticated system was deployed. Transmitters across Britain broadcast an additional dash signal synchronized to the Knickebein beam. If a German pilot was flying correctly along the center of the beam, hearing the balanced tone, the British transmitter added extra dashes. The pilot now heard a signal that made him believe he had drifted too far into the dash zone. He would instinctively steer toward the dot zone to compensate, flying further and further off course while believing he was perfectly on track. The beam appeared to bend. The Germans used a term for what was happening: Strahlenbiegung, beam bending. They believed the British had developed a method of physically curving their radio signals. The truth was both simpler and more cunning. The British weren't bending the beams, they were lying to the pilots, and the pilots couldn't tell the difference. The system was given code names worthy of a dark comedy. The German beams were called Headache. The British countermeasures were called Aspirin. The unit responsible, number 80 Signals Wing of the Royal Air Force, was headquartered at a requisitioned country house in Radlett, Hertfordshire, and operated under the motto, "Confusion to our enemies." If you're finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The results were immediate. German bombers began scattering their payloads across the British countryside. Bombs intended for Birmingham fell on open farmland. Loads aimed at industrial targets detonated in empty fields. Pilots returned to base, reporting successful attacks on targets they had never actually reached. The psychological effect was perhaps more important than the physical. German bomber crews had been trained to trust the beams absolutely. When the beams told them they were over the target, they dropped their bombs and turned for home. They had no way of knowing the signals had been corrupted, no way of checking, no second opinion. The beam was their truth, and the British had made it lie. Simultaneously, a parallel system called Meacon attacked Germany's ordinary navigational beacons. British receivers intercepted German beacon signals and retransmitted them from different locations, confusing the direction-finding equipment in German aircraft. Bombers trying to navigate home found their compasses pointing in contradictory directions. Some flew in circles, some ran out of fuel over the English Channel, and in several documented incidents, German bomber crews became so disoriented they landed at British airfields, believing they had returned to their bases in occupied France. On the 14th of February 1941, a Heinkel pilot named Hans Thurner of Kampfgeschwader 55 reportedly touched down at 3 separate British airfields in a single sortie. Discovering his mistake each time and taking off again before being captured, he eventually found his way back to France. He was later awarded the Knight's Cross. Whether for his bombing skills or his talent for escape remains unclear. But the Germans were not fools. They knew something was wrong. Knickebein was being defeated, and they had already prepared a successor. It was called Gerät, the X apparatus, and it operated on entirely different frequencies, around 60 MHz instead of Knickebein's 30. It used a more sophisticated beam structure, with multiple crossbeams, each named after a German river, Weser, Rhine, Oder, Elbe. And it was operated by an elite Pathfinder unit, Kampfgruppe 100, whose pilots called themselves the Vikings. Kampfgruppe 100 flew ahead of the main bomber force, following the Gerät beams with extraordinary precision, and dropped incendiaries to mark the target. The following bombers simply aimed for the fires. For a brief, terrible period, the system worked brilliantly. In August 1940, the Vikings dropped 156 tons of bombs on British factories with devastating accuracy. Only 2 crewmen were injured. Only 1 aircraft reported damage. Jones had anticipated a second system. He had been monitoring intelligence intercepts that referenced something beyond Knickebein. But Gerät operated on frequencies his existing jammers couldn't reach. New countermeasures, codenamed Bromide, had to be developed and deployed. Then came the catastrophe. On the 14th of November 1940, Jones's intelligence indicated that a major Gerät attack was imminent against a target codenamed by the Germans as number 53. He identified it as Coventry. He correctly deduced the beam frequency, but a clerical error transmitted the wrong frequency to the jamming stations. The bromide transmitters were set incorrectly. The Gerät beams passed through unimpeded. That night, 449 German bombers dropped over 500 tons of high explosive and nearly 30,000 incendiaries on Coventry. The medieval cathedral was destroyed. 568 people were killed. Over 800 were seriously injured. The word Coventry entered the German language, meaning to destroy a city by aerial bombardment. The failure haunted Jones for the rest of his life. He later wrote that the error was one of the most painful episodes of the war. Had the jamming frequency been correct, the bombs might have fallen on empty ground instead. But the failure was also a lesson. Within days, an ex-Gerät equipped Heinkel 111 crashed on the English coast near Bridport. The waterlogged equipment was recovered and analysed. For the first time, British engineers could examine the exact technology they were fighting. They discovered that the ex-Gerät receiver used a sharp filter tuned precisely to 2000 Hz. British jammers had been transmitting at 1500 Hz, close enough to fool a human ear in a noisy cockpit. But the machine wasn't listening with human ears. It had filtered out the British signal entirely. With this knowledge, the countermeasures were recalibrated. A new technique was deployed, the false Elbe. Instead of jamming the beams, the British set up a phantom crossbeam that intersected the main weather guide beam only 1 kilometre after the first real crossbeam, instead of the expected 5 kilometres. The German bomb release mechanism was automatic at this stage. It started a clock when the first crossbeam was detected and released bombs when the calculated distance was reached. But the premature false crossbeam started the clock too early. The bombs fell kilometres short of their targets. Ex-Gerät was defeated. The Germans tried once more. A third system, WWII Gerät, also called Wotan, used a single beam with a distance measuring feature. The ground station transmitted pulses to the aircraft, which automatically retransmitted them. By measuring the time delay, controllers could calculate the bomber's exact distance along the beam and radio the pilot when to drop. Jones cracked this system before it was even deployed. His method was almost absurdly simple. He learned the codename Wotan and asked a colleague at Bletchley Park about the word. Wotan was a one-eyed god. One eye, one beam. Jones deduced from nothing more than a name that WWII Gerät used a single beam with distance measurement. He was exactly right. The countermeasure was elegant. British engineers used the BBC's television transmitter at Alexandra Palace in London to retransmit the WWII Gerät signal with a slight delay. This corrupted the distance calculations at the German ground station, making them believe the aircraft was in a different position than it actually was. Jones increased the interference gradually, like slowly turning up the volume, so the Germans attributed the errors to equipment malfunction rather than enemy action. Eventually, the interference was cranked up so high that the entire WWII Gerät system began to ring with feedback, like a microphone placed in front of its own speaker. The Luftwaffe, finally realizing the British had been deploying countermeasures from the very first day the system was used, completely lost faith in electronic navigation aids. They did not deploy any further beam system against Great Britain. Jones had won. A 28-year-old physicist, working with scraps of intelligence, fragments of captured equipment, and the trust of a prime minister, had fought an invisible war against 3 successive German navigation systems and defeated all 3. The bombs that should have destroyed Britain's factories, its engine plants, its industrial heart, had instead fallen on fields and farmland across the English countryside. The German systems were pioneered by physicist Johannes Plendl, who had developed beam navigation concepts since 1937. His work was technically brilliant. Knickebein could guide bombers to within 300 meters of a target from hundreds of kilometers away. Ex-Gerät was even more precise, placing bombs within 100 meters of the beam centerline. The Americans had nothing comparable at this stage of the war. Their own navigation systems, G, E, and later Loran, would not become operational until 1942 and owed a considerable debt to the lessons learned in the Battle of the Beams. The British, ironically, proved through aerial reconnaissance that their own bombers were rarely hitting their intended targets either. The Butt Report of August 1941 revealed that only 1 in 3 aircraft claiming to have attacked their targets had actually dropped bombs within 8 kilometers. The Battle of the Beams lasted from June 1940 to May 1941, when the Luftwaffe moved its bomber forces east for the invasion of the Soviet Union. In that time, Number 80 Signals Wing, with approximately 2,000 personnel operating 15 Aspirin sites and 9 Beacon stations across Britain, had fought one of history's first electronic warfare campaigns. The legacy is immense. Every modern electronic warfare system, every radar jammer, every GPS spoofing device, every signals intelligence operation traces its conceptual ancestry to the work done by Jones, Cockburn, and 80 Wing in those desperate months of 1940 and 41. Jones himself went on to identify German radar systems, plan the Bruneval raid to capture German radar equipment, and contribute to the deception operations supporting D-Day. His autobiography, Most Secret War, published in 1978, remains one of the finest accounts of scientific intelligence ever written. Jones died in 1997 at the age of 86. The archives of his work are held at Churchill College, Cambridge. Surviving examples of Knickebein and ex-Gerät equipment can be seen at the Imperial War Museum in London and the RAF Museum at Hendon. The remains of Knickebein transmitter stations still stand at locations across Europe, concrete foundations overgrown with grass, monuments to a battle fought entirely in the electromagnetic spectrum. The Battle of the Beams wasn't fought with guns or courage or sacrifice, though there was plenty of all three. It was fought with physics, with deception, with the understanding that in modern warfare, the most devastating weapon isn't always the one that explodes. Sometimes it's the one that makes the enemy believe a lie, and the most terrifying lie of all is the one you never suspect, the one that sounds exactly like the truth, steady, confident, guiding you through the darkness toward a target that doesn't exist. The Germans trusted their beams, the British bent them, and across the English countryside, in fields where no factory stood and no city slept, the craters filled slowly with rainwater, the only evidence of a war fought in silence, in frequencies no human ear could hear, between scientists who never met, over a country wrapped in darkness. One beam, one lie, one physicist at a time.